Welcome back to NC State Dendrology. So I'm coming to you today from Umstead State Park, and this is another oak that is very typical. Actually, its range extends into the mountains. So this is Quercus, Montana, called chestnut oak, common name chestnut oak or rock chestnut oak, also in the Fagaceae. And so this is another one of these oaks that likes dry, rocky soils, but it's also a really important component in the chestnut oak forests of the mountains. So this is one that's like a very typical mid-elevation species, but around here in the Piedmont, it tends to favor these dry, rocky sites. That's where it's most competitive. So one thing that's really important to see about chestnut oak is that it has this very ridged, rough, cobbled bark. That is very typical for chestnut oak. It's very different from any of the other oaks that we'll see and learn in NC State Dendrology. So this very, rough, ridged bark is very typical. If I'm looking around the ground, I can see quite a bit of quartz. Is very rocky in this area, and so that might be one reason why it's called rock chestnut oak. And a former name for this oak is Quercus prinus, before it was recognized that there were specimens collected of this species and one that looks very similar but is in a very different habitat. So when I teach you this tree today, we're actually not going to look at swamp chestnut oak, which is another species, but it does have some traits to look out for. So importantly, chestnut oak is in the white oak family. And I want to show you, turn the camera and show you just the understory here, the herb layer, right? So you can see all these little seedlings on the ground. Those are baby chestnut oaks. Okay, so chestnut oaks, remember, white oaks drop their acorns in the fall, but they germinate right away. They germinate in the fall. So all these little seedlings are taking off, right? They won't all survive, but they're taking off, and that's very typical. So one of the reasons why that they might want to germinate in the fall is that these are extremely high wildlife value. So I'm going to show you this acorn here. Okay, y'all know that is not chestnut oak. This is white oak, right? See the cap and how oblong it is? Okay, don't be fooled. That's a little quiz, an extra quiz question. So chestnut oaks, but for comparison, since you already know white oaks, I can show you these two oak acorns side by side for comparison. So, okay, so white oak acorns are oblong with a little cap on top that is cobbled. Chestnut oak has these big fat acorns, and remember, they don't have high levels of tannins, so they have a very high wildlife value. Importantly, it's really easy. This is one of the acorns I need you to know, so I'm going to drop my white oak acorn and talk about chestnut oak or Quercus montana. So it is a very large acorn, one of the largest ones that we'll learn besides swamp chestnut oak. And one thing that's notable, the cap is cobbled, kind of like white oak, right? So it's not scaly like the red oaks. And the other thing that's important is that if you look at the edge of the acorn cap is very thin and tapered. It's not fat, it doesn't wrap around the acorn, right? So here's another example. Okay, so you see how thin that edge is of the acorn cap. That's really important. That's going to help you tell it apart from Quercus machoii. And here's just the cap all by itself. So it's a cobbled acorn cap, rounded a little bit like a hat, and it has this very thin edge of the acorn cap. So let's take a look at the leaves, because the leaves are very distinctive. The leaves are variable in size. So this is one that I just pulled off a tree that's kind of in the open. So you can see that this is really not a lobed leaf. I would call this unlobed, but how would you describe the edge? I would call it scalloped or crenate, right? So it has a crenate leaf margin. So very distinctive and fairly easy to tell. Notice that, remember we already learned Quercus bicolor. This does not have lobes like Quercus bicolor. The edge of the margin is a little bit similar. They are a little bit fuzzy underneath. And then here's one of the seedling leaves that I picked up. So I always think of chestnut oak as having these, I would call it slightly obovate, but they can actually be quite obovate, right? So if you just draw a line around the edge of the leaf margin connecting the lobes, you would see that they are wider towards the tip, than the middle, right? So we wouldn't call it elliptical because that would be symmetrical. I would call this obovate, right, with a crenate leaf margin. So that's really distinctive for chestnut oak. Chestnut oak does not have a lot of wood value. It tends to have a lot of branching in it, but it is in the white oak group, so it does have tyloses and tight cooperage. But this is a very valuable species for wildlife because of the big fat acorns that they have that are coming off the trees. This is looking like a mast year in North Carolina, at least in the Piedmont. All the oak trees that we are looking at in lab this week are absolutely loaded with acorns. And so there's kind of a story and an explanation behind that. So anytime you see or observe something in nature, you have to ask why. What would be the evolutionary advantage of having acorns? And a characteristic of oaks is that they have masting. And so what that means, masting means that the oaks will have a year where they produce lots of acorns followed by several years of very few acorns. So that's an evolutionary advantage because it's a response, a little bit of coevolution going on to wildlife. So if you have produced the same number of acorns every year, the surrounding wildlife population is going to rise to meet that, right? To eat all that food because it's available. And very important wildlife use, deer love these acorns, bears, squirrels, and other small mammals love the acorns. And so you're going to have the wildlife population respond if you have a consistent mast, right, or this acorns and woody nutrition for wildlife. However, if you alter the number of acorns you produce every year, right, so you have a couple years that are sparse, the wildlife populations may respond to that, but then you follow that with a year where they put all their energy into producing a huge crop of acorns. That means there's a good chance that some of those will survive and develop into seedlings. So that's just a little ecology lesson tied to this very high wildlife value oak, chestnut oak, or Quercus montana.